nearly a year after the 1619 Project landed in magazine stands, and here it is, this beautiful booklet that came with the New York Times and re-examined the history of slavery in the United States, and won a Pulitzer, by the way, for Nicole Hannah-Jones and those who put it together. Pretty big deal. And got America rethinking the whole history of the United States. Senator Tom Cotton of Arkansas, who himself, it was recently revealed, has a history of a family that were slave owners. I guess his great-great-great-grandfather owned slaves.
I guess he knows that because he's been acting pretty racist lately.
Well, he came out and said that he would like to see the 1619 Project banned from America's classrooms. Now, the 1619 Project was not only a huge success, it's filled with incredible essays that elucidate American history from a real standpoint, and talked about the centrality of white supremacy in the founding of the nation. I mean, if you think about it, this is a country that was founded on the basis of creating a new kind of freedom for white men who were not necessarily of noble birth, and who wanted to be free of the king's power, but who wanted to also have the power to own other people. Tom Cotton has said that this book should be banned. And not only does he want it to be banned from America's classrooms, he also wants to try to sanction schools, that essentially they would lose school funding if they adopted the project as part of their curriculum. And so if this selection of essays and poems and fiction and factual essays and history was added to the curriculums of American schools, he says that America, that it falsely labels America a systemically racist country.
I don't understand what his objections are. Obviously, Americans should want to learn about their history. Why would they want to not learn about this?
History is not friendly. And
yeah,
he
I understand, but it is the truth.
And Cotton said, as the founding fathers said, if slavery was the necessary evil upon which the Union was built. That's what he told the Arkansas Democratic Gazette.
Necessary evil.
The necessary evil upon which the Union was built. And he said the Union was built in a way, as Lincoln said, to put slavery on the course to its ultimate extinction. That's actually not true. The Union was not built in a way to put slavery on the road to extinction. It was actually built to preserve the slave holdings of people like George Washington, James Madison, and Thomas Jefferson, three of the founding fathers, who all owned hundreds and hundreds of slaves. As I have said to students whenever I've taught a class, do you ever wonder why the vast majority of people with the last name Washington, Jefferson, and Jackson are black? Like, whenever you meet somebody named Washington, Jefferson, or Jackson, they're almost always black. They're you don't meet that many white Washingtons, Jeffersons, and Jacksons.
They had a lot of babies on the side.
Well, it's not because of the babies on the side who were also enslaved, because of course we know that people like Thomas Jefferson.
They had a lot of mistresses on the side.
No, they had a lot of slaves.
I get that.
So if you figure that if you had one Washington and his wife Martha is able to, give birth to, let's say, 4 living children, and the rest die of consumption, but 4 of her children live, that makes 4 Washingtons. Well, that makes 6 Washingtons. George Washington, Martha Washington, and 4 little Washington kids. But if he owns 300 slaves, all of their surname is Washington. So if each of those, enslaved people, let's say, result in 200 new enslaved people that are born from those slaves, whether they're born through rape by, white folks on the plantation, or just through natural couplings between people, you have suddenly 600 Washingtons, and then 800 Washingtons. And then eventually you've got like 1,000 Washingtons, and you still only have 6 Washingtons in the big house. And if you keep doing that math over the course of time and over the course of history, you suddenly have 10,000 Washingtons, and let's say maybe 20 Washingtons in the big house. And then maybe you have like 30 Washingtons born from the big house, and 2,000. You see the math. The math quickly adds up. So the reason so many people with the last name Washington, Jefferson, and Jackson are black is because Washington, Jefferson, Andrew Jackson, James Madison, these people owned a lot of people. And so they named all of the people they owned with their last name. They slapped their last name on them because that was their sign of ownership of those people. Not because they loved those people, or they were related to those people, or they consider those people to be family. No, in their mind, they own those people. It's like a brand they put on those people. So it's just interesting that somebody like Tom Cotton, who is a son of the South from Arkansas, would like to not have that history taught because that history is unpleasant. I'm sure it's personally unpleasant for him because it's also his history. But it's also unpleasant for a lot of Americans who like to think of America as this noble country that was founded by good old Christians who just wanted freedom. Well, they wanted freedom for themselves, not necessarily for their wives, their daughters, or the enslaved people, or for the indigenous people they came across. Those people they felt were inferior to them, and therefore they own them. Just saying. It's an interesting thing about American history that's happening because of the 1619 Project, in part, and also because Americans are having this rediscovery of American history, both because President Obama was president and we had a first black president, so people were like, ooh, let's get into history. And then Donald Trump becomes president, and he becomes the defender of the old Confederate order, and he's trying so hard to restore an America from the past in which white people were superior and were thought to be superior to everybody else. And so in the minds of people like Tom Cotton, we can't disrupt that narrative because we have to have a history in which the founders were good people and moral people, and the system they founded was good and moral, because then otherwise, how do you get people to be patriotic toward a country that has done wrong and has done evil to its own citizens? Well, Germany figured out how to do it. And so I'm pretty sure we can figure out how to do it too. Because the founders of the country were actually incredibly racist, and thought they had the right to own other human beings. And they wrote a constitution in which that would be perpetual. I don't think they were like, it's temporary. Like the 3/5 clause said that we'll let these black people be 3/5 of a person. I'm not sure that they wrote in there that that's temporary. The Civil War eventually happened because the things that they also wrote about freedom and liberty were just incompatible with a system in which white Christian men own other people. And eventually that incompatibility dawned on enough other people, including Abraham Lincoln, who didn't particularly like black people or want black people in America, but who understood that it was a contradiction that just couldn't stand. And so everything about American history, if you really look at it and you really dig into it, all dials back to this racist start of the country. And there's nothing you can do about it. And so learning about it is the least you can do, because you're going to have to know eventually that this is what your country is if you're going to fix it. So anyway, we're having this reckoning on race at a time when a lot more white people are writing about race in a very forthright way, and writing about their own history and their own growing up understanding of race in a way that is a lot more has a lot more foresight and a lot more introspection. And we have somebody on the podcast today who's done that probably, I think, better than anybody else in the business, and who has written about race in a really profound and important way with data and charts, which is always the best way to write about anything. Data and charts are great. Let's bring in our guest. And joining me now is, I'm going to throw it out there, my favorite pollster, somebody that I've gotten to know at the Brookings Institution, the man behind the Public Religion Research Institute poll, brilliant author of previous books like The End of White Christian America, and whose new book is called White Too Long, The Legacy of White Supremacy in American Christianity, Robert P., a.k.a. Robbie Jones. Robbie, it's so great to talk to you.
Oh, hey, great to talk to you as well.
So I want to first of all congratulate you on the book. It's a pretty brave book to write. You know, I remember talking with you about when you your previous book, The End of White Christian America, came out, and you talked about how uncomfortable some folks were with the title. This one is probably not going to make people any happier. White Too Long, The Legacy of White Supremacy in American Christianity. Why'd you write it, and what are people going to learn from it?
Well, as you know, like my day job, I spent a lot of time looking at public opinion data. And, so I think one of the reasons why I wrote it is because I just kept seeing this pattern in the public opinion data. Whenever we would ask questions about racial attitudes, and not just about personal racism, that is something like, do you feel warmly toward African Americans or something like that? But when we would ask more substantive questions about Confederate symbols and monuments, or the treatment of African Americans by police, these more structural justice questions, we would see these huge gaps between white Christians on the one hand, and not just white evangelicals, the more conservative end of the white Christian world, but we would see this among white mainline Protestants, among white Catholics, and this huge gap between these groups of white Christians on the one hand and attitudes of African Americans on the other, and even this gap between them and attitudes of whites who were not religious. And so I really began to kind of dig into that more. And then honestly, I think, these last 4 years, as, really we moved with Donald Trump's campaign from, what had been a long history of dog whistle politics around, racist attitudes and issues, but into this kind of megaphone, era that we've been in. I think this is also an issue. And then I should say, too, that this book is also very personal. The End of White Christian America, I mostly kept on my social scientist hat, really describing the demographic changes in the country and how I thought that explained the phenomenon of Donald Trump and particularly the reactions of white Christians to his candidacy. But in this book, I really draw on and put myself in the story. I mean, I grew up white and Christian. I grew up a Southern Baptist in Mississippi predominantly, and my family goes back 6 generations into Middle Georgia, all the way into the 1700s, all the way back. And so I'm very much a part of this story. So really, the book is my own kind of journey of coming to grips with this legacy of white supremacy and how it shaped the faith that I grew up in.
Yeah, I want to read a little bit from the book, and this is from a chapter in which you talk about Frederick Douglass and the confounding influence of Christianity on white supremacy. And here's the quote: "I am filled with unutterable loathing when I contemplate the religious pomp and show, together with the horrible inconsistencies which everywhere surround me. We have ministers for ministers, we have women worshipers for missionaries, and cradle plunderers for church members. The man who wields the blood-clotted cowskin during the week fills the pulpit on Sunday and claims to be a minister of the meek and lowly Jesus. The man who robs me of my earnings at the end of each week meets me as a class leader on Sunday morning to show me the way of life and the path of salvation. He who sells my sister for purposes of prostitution stands forth as the pious advocate of purity. He who proclaims it a religious duty to read the Bible denies me the right of learning to read the name of God who made me. He who is the religious advocate of marriage robs whole millions of its sacred influence and leaves them to the ravages of wholesale pollution." The contradiction between slavery and enslavement and the Christian founding of the nation, which conservatives really like to tout, even though they were a little bit slightly different. They were deists, but either way, that contradiction goes all the way back to the founding of the country. Is that the kind of core flaw in the American Christian church?
I first of all, I should say, I mean, those are such painful, words to hear. And Douglas those words come from his first autobiography. And what's remarkable about it is he has this whole appendix at the back that has gotten very short shrift, particularly by white theologians and white historians, where he just excoriates the current expressions of white Christianity, and with those words that you have just read. And what's even more notable is that he says in his own experience, for example, someone that in his own experience being enslaved, that he found that, and talking with others as well, that when a white slave owner converted to Christianity, they had high hopes that would make them better or a more humane slave owner, if you can even say such a thing. But what he found is it actually made the cruelty worse because they had not just their own kind of human conscience to answer to, but they actually had a religious justification for the entire system, which actually turned out to kind of release the curbs on their own cruelty, and they actually ended up being worse. That this was a common view among enslaved people. That, and he in fact says something like, I'll paraphrase it here, but he says, next to being a slave itself, being enslaved by a white Christian slave owner is among the worst calamities I could imagine, for myself. So, that history is there. And if you think about the early setup of a society that had an a priori commitment to white supremacy, whether it was a slaveholding state or not, and the widely shared thing was that there was this a priori commitment to white supremacy. And so, those churches, it wasn't that uncommon, right, for slave owners to bring enslaved people to church with them, and whites would sit in the front, enslaved African Americans would sit in the back, or in specially constructed balconies. And in fact, today in some of the older churches, you can still see the legacy of this literally built into the architecture. So if that is the seedbed of early, much of early Christianity, you have to ask yourself, like, what could be preached in those settings? What could be sung? What hymns could be sung? What rituals could be performed? It all becomes fairly disfigured and distorted by this kind of prior commitment to white supremacy, around which Christian theology and practice is formed.
And it's eerie to think about the symmetry between what Frederick Douglass was saying about the Christian church and the refusal to accept full equality of African Americans, and what Dr. King said, which was the same thing that he said in the letter to the Birmingham jail about the black and white church in a lot of ways refusing to accept the idea of equality now. You write about, as you said, you put yourself in the story, growing up amid the Confederacy. What did you learn growing up about the history of the country when it came to race when you were a kid?
Yeah, well, growing up, virtually nothing. And I think that's the point. I should say, I was this kid who was at church 5 days a week. I was there Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday night Bible study. I was there all the time. But I think what was remarkable to me, working on the book, was sitting with that enough to realize that I never heard a single sermon on civil rights. And I grew up in the 1970s and 80s in Jackson, Mississippi. I never heard a single sermon on civil rights or racial inequality. I never heard a single Sunday school lesson that looked at our own history and complicity in that history. And for Southern Baptists, I grew up Southern Baptist, so our denomination was literally formed to allow this compatibility between slavery in 1845, this compatibility between slavery and Christianity. And so even with that history to my own denomination, I was well into my 20s and in seminary before I really heard much at all about this history.
And you sound a lot like you could have been part of the 1619 Project, because there's a whole big debate now where you have a lot of white Christians, the Tom Cottons of the world, the Tucker Carlsons and others, who are very angry about the idea of other people learning this history. They seem to think that it is somehow denouncing the United States as a country to learn this history. What do you say to people who say that teaching this and excavating this history is un-American, makes you a bad American?
Yeah, I think the first thing I think of is it's time for us to grow up. It's such a naive way of thinking about who we are as a country. And I think the moment of reckoning that we're at, it really is about having a more honest conversation, a more accurate history, and a really a better understanding of who we are and how we got here. And you can't do that. I think for many whites, this is certainly for white Christians, it's a very difficult thing to hear, right? Because there are some just appalling and shameful episode after episode in this history. But I think even for white Christians, if we, and I'll say we here, and I should say, in the book, quick digression, I begin the book, the first sentence has the word I in it. The last sentence of the book has the word us in it. So, if we white Christians want to know who we are, what role we have really played in the country, and it's not all bad, that's for sure, but this myth of innocence, I think, is the biggest thing in the way of the truth. And so, if I take something out of my own religious upbringing, I mean, I heard this verse a lot, growing up out of the New Testament, that you shall know the truth and the truth will make you free. And I think it's long past time for white Christians to really have a more honest reckoning with our history. I think that will help us, be in better relationship with our African-American brothers and sisters. But I think it'll also help us return to some health in our own churches and theologies. Because, when you take this seriously and you think about how disfigured white Christianity has become because of this commitment to white supremacy, it's going to take quite a bit of work, I think, to unravel the two and figure out which part is white and which part is Christian.
Very well said. I'm going to read another little piece from the book, and this is from a chapter called Marking, and it's you quote a gentleman named Pastor Lenny Duncan, who wrote a book called Dear White Church, a love letter from a black preacher to the whitest denomination in the U.S., and it was written by a Lutheran to fellow Lutherans. And Reverend Duncan, you said, pulls few punches in calling his denomination to go beyond easy condemnation of personal racism. While the churches have called racism a sin, Duncan argues that focusing on the personal misunderstands the nature and magnitude of the problem. White supremacy doesn't need active racists to function, he writes. It is a demonic system with a life of its own. It is radical evil. And Duncan also notes that dismantling this system is going to take some very difficult, introspective, and uncomfortable reparative actions on the part of white Christians. And you're talking about the Lutherans here. So this is every denomination of white Christian churches that have to deal with this. But what kind of reparative actions do you think it would take for Christians to take a step forward toward reconciliation with Black Americans, with American history?
Yeah, so it's that piece from Lenny Duncan is so important. I learned so much from that book and his take as an African American minister inside of, as he calls it, the whitest denomination in the country. So this is the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, which is a mainline Protestant denomination that has its roots really in the upper Midwest among Scandinavian, particularly immigrants to the country. So it's a very interesting context. It's not a Deep South denomination that he's talking about, and yet he still sees this problem very clearly there. And this line about that he makes that white supremacy doesn't need active racists to function, I think is the key here. Eddie Glaude has said some very similar things that I draw on in the book as well. But this is the thing that's very difficult for white Christians to see, right? So the knee-jerk reaction is, well, look, I'm not racist. I have a couple of black friends, and I don't harbor any ill will toward particular black people or even black people as a whole. But one of the more stunning findings in the social science data that I take up in the book is that you can actually see this in the data. So, for example, among white Christians, if you ask questions like, do you feel warmly toward African Americans, all white Christian groups, including even white evangelicals, score fairly high on these scales, reporting, yes, I have very warm feelings toward African Americans. And churchgoers, white Christians who are churchgoers, are particularly more likely to say that I have warm feelings. But if you ask questions about the killing of black men by police, Confederate monuments, the legacy of slavery, and the inequalities that we see all around us today, those kinds of questions, white Christians score fairly low on being able to see these structural issues as issues of justice and as the legacy of white supremacy. And it's this moral blindness, really, that I'm trying to hold up to in the book, and that Pastor Duncan was referring to there as well. So I think the first step to kind of get to the kind of where we go, I think the first step is really about white Christians spending enough time, I think, with their own history and asking enough honest questions so that there's not a quick dismissal of, oh, well, if I'm not racist, then we're good, right? And if every white Christian is not racist, then we're good. The fact is that we have inherited a faith that has built its theology around this assumption, has built its church practices, and built its churches around this. I mean, for goodness sake, if you just ask many white Christians, like, why is your church located where it is? Is it in a sort of all-white suburb? How did it get there? When was it built? Was it moved out with white flight? As white people moved out from cities in the 60s and 70s. If it's an older church, like what role did it play in the civil rights movement, or in the defense of Jim Crow, or as you mentioned this Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail, and this line that is echoed with me throughout the writing here of, he talked about the anesthetizing silence of people sitting behind their anesthetizing stained glass windows in the churches and just remaining silent to this injustice all around us. So I think the first step is that. And then I think the one other word I'll say about reconciliation quickly here is that I do think white Christians should stop talking about reconciliation, and they should start talking about justice and repair. And I think we should let our African American brothers and sisters tell us when we've done enough repair that we're reconciled. Reconciliation, I think, is an organic outgrowth of justice and repair. And that's really the responsibility. If you're really thinking about what repentance means, it's not just sort of lamenting that you did something wrong. It's not just lamenting that history went the way it did and issuing an apology, but it is about taking responsibility for that, repairing doing what you can to put some measures in place to repair the damage, and reconciliation comes, I think, as an outgrowth of that work.
And it strikes me that, one of the first things that would be helpful, as you said, is for people to actually learn American history. Like, people are finding out about the Tulsa Massacre from Watchmen, right? And before they watch Watchmen, they're like, well, that's not, people will watch that opening scene and think, well, that's just fiction, when it's actually quite accurate, in the way it's portrayed, even down to the planes bombing the city.
Right, absolutely.
But the challenge also is going to be for white Christians. A lot of white Christian America has taken their children out of public schools. So even if, let's say, the 1619 Project was taught in every school in America, every public school, there's also been this move since Brown versus Board of Education to create private education, private school, whether it's homeschool or just private schools, period, that turn out to also be all white, all Christian, even the university systems that they've created that exclude people. How did that emerge? Was that a direct result of Brown?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. The history is really clear here. The historians have actually dubbed these as segregation academies. They were often called Christian academies, but in my home state of Mississippi, these essentially sprung up very shortly after Brown v. Board of Education, or in the case of Mississippi, they thought they could hold that off for a while. So it was maybe it didn't happen right after Brown, but once it looked like the implementation of Brown on the ground was inevitable, and that wasn't going to be able to be resisted or fought. Many of the public schools emptied out literally over one summer break or one winter break here, including like white students taking their publicly funded textbooks with them over to the church funded, private Christian academy, really over a matter of a few weeks, and leaving the public school system with only African-American students in it. And there's just a long legacy of this. You can still see its imprint, all over the South in particular today and that did have the sense of, again, reinforcing not only a sense of whiteness, but a sense of how whiteness was wedded to Christian identity, and very overtly about, providing a superior education for whites who were Christian while leaving the public school systems fairly unfunded and to fend for themselves.
I think about the Little Rock School that's now, became so famous for being desegregated in 1957, is now like an almost all black school. Like a lot of those schools are now almost all black. It is pretty, pretty intentional, very clearly intentional. Is this regional? You do write in White Too Long about the regionality of this, because a lot of people assume that, well, this is a Southern thing. But I know if anyone who's lived in New York can tell you there's a whole lot of racism in New York, Chicago, Massachusetts, go to Boston, go anywhere, and you're going to find it too. How much of this is regional?
Yeah, not as much as one would think, as you point out. And just to take one example, the Tulsa riots that people are just learning about a bit, but and if we kind of go back to the summer of 1919, there's a lot of parallels to today. Not only we were coming off of the national flu pandemic, but there was this has also been dubbed Red Summer by historians. There were riots in more than 35 cities around the country, and they were really about whites enforcing and continuing to erect a Jim Crow society that was really about protecting white opportunity, white jobs, all of this, and African Americans resisting this move that resulted in violent outbursts. And again, not in the South, we're Chicago, New York, all over the country here. And one of the notable things I think in the data is that when I looked at these attitudes and these gaps between white Christians and whites who are not religiously unaffiliated, for example, these gaps don't just appear in the South. In fact, some of the bigger gaps are in the Northeast and also in the Midwest. And so in the world where white mainline Protestants are most dominant in the upper Midwest, in the context that Lenny Duncan was writing about, these huge gaps persist. In the world of the Northeast and more urban settings where white Catholics kind of are more dominant along with white mainline Protestants, again, we see these things. And even when I controlled for region, partisanship, education levels, gender, all kinds of things that you could think of that might be other explanatory variables, this strong relationship between holding more racist attitudes and white Christian identity remain very robust. And again, not just in the South, but really all over the country, and particularly in the Midwest and the Northeast as well.
So meaning that no matter where you live, that the through line is not necessarily being white, it's specifically being white and Christian. Yeah, that's right. I mean, that's one of the reasons why I kept trying to pay attention to those whites who are not Christian. And it really is the Christian identity kind of welded to whiteness that seems to be doing a lot of the work here, because you would see 20, 30 point gaps between whites who are religiously unaffiliated versus whites who are affiliated with really any Christian tradition here. Wow. It really, when you say that, it really is searing to think about the fact that somebody like William Barr, the Attorney General, his side gig is giving speeches about how we need to return to a white Christian identity, or not a white, he doesn't say white Christian, but to a Christian identity in America, and that's what's being lost and it's being destroyed by the left. Do you think that's part of the reason that you do have this real anger about secularism, particularly among conservative media and people like William Barr, that secularism actually correlates to diminishing overt white supremacy and racism?
Yeah. I think there is, but, I think it actually isn't so much about secularism. I mean, even so, a lot of press has been made, and rightly so, about the growing number of religiously unaffiliated people in the country, which is about a quarter today. And among young people, it's 40%. So it's fairly high, and that's new and that's real. But I think the real shift here and the real animating force is the loss of white Christian dominance in the country. Is actually, it's more about that loss than it is the rise of something else, right? And so if you think about, for example, even someone who's thought of as a fairly progressive president, FDR, infamously said, this is a white Protestant country and everyone else is here by sufferance, so the sense that this white Anglo-Saxon Protestant waspy identity is America, right? I think that's what's being lost, and I think that's what has caused, I think, really this. You and I have talked about this before, but I think this sense of a loss of ownership in America in particular, that it was seen to be identified with a white Christian identity, and that's just no longer demographically tenable. It's no longer culturally tenable. And I think it's that loss that has really set off some of the panic among white conservative Christians, and is actually some of a significant amount of the fuel to the fire that has sort of pushed them toward this allegiance with Donald Trump, with really his backward-looking, make America great again, right? It's all about that last word again, about turning back the clock to a previous time.
Yeah. Well, they should have thought about that before dragging black and brown and Asian people here to do all the work. Just saying. Might have been a little bit of forethought, might have been helpful. Talk a little bit about this monuments thing. You do write about the many, many monuments that people are really freaking out about them being taken down, particularly the fact that they aren't even monuments that had anything to do with the Civil War. I mean, they went up 60, 70 years later as a way to tell black people in the South that you're not getting anything out of this country no matter what. What is it about these monuments? Why are people so freaked out about, taking down monuments to people who killed American troops, killed Union troops?
Yeah, well, I think you're exactly right to point out one of the key things to understanding the monuments in the context of American history is to understand when they were put up. I mean, these were not put up, even in the South, they were not put up in the 1860s for the most part. They were put up 3, 4, 5 decades after the close of the Civil War. And they were really very much intended to be declarations of cultural victory. That is the cultural victory of the continued commitment to white supremacy, even in the face of military and political defeat. So they're often called like lost cause, part of a kind of lost cause theology or ideology, where they were these statements and assertions, and many of them were put up by this group called the United Daughters of the Confederacy, which put up some of the most massive ones around the country, including most of the ones in Richmond that have been recently partially dismantled at least. But they were very intentionally meant to declare. I mean, I'm thinking about one, the biggest one in Richmond was the one for Jefferson Davis. It was put up in 1907. 200,000 people showed up for this, and across a 3-day celebration, including 18,000 Confederate veterans that they paraded around. And what was notable to me in that is that across the 3-day celebration, they intentionally broke on Sunday morning so that all these participants could go and attend a local white Christian church as part of the celebration and the installation of this monument to the former president of the Confederacy. And on the biggest part of the spire in that monument is a giant bronze sculpture of a woman with her finger pointed to the sky in defiance. And under it, in these kind of bronze letters, it says, God will vindicate, right? This very overt appeal to, a Christian God in defense of the Confederacy, and a declaration that ultimately this worldview, this white supremacist worldview, would be vindicated and would be realized in the U.S. context. And that was really, the goal of the United Daughters of the Confederacy in installing many of these monuments across the country, that included even depictions of Confederate flags in the Washington National Cathedral that have now been removed. But that's how far it reached, this real desire to kind of put these monuments up in public spaces that were really declarations, particularly aimed at African Americans, to say, look, make no mistake, yes, slavery is now outlawed, but make no mistake who is in charge, and make no mistake where your place is in this community.
And I'll ask you just to dig a little bit deeper into the why, because I think when a lot of people think about why are people racist, like what is it that justifies in their mind, being racist and basing that somehow on biblical belief, which makes no sense. First of all, the fact that Jesus was a Semitic person who wouldn't have even been identified as white by them. They're not exactly that super fond necessarily. They're not saying that Jewish people are the superior, you know what I mean? Like Jewish people who relate, who are in the same background as Jesus, they're not holding them up, they're holding themselves up. And it's a weird thing. You write about this idea, the mark of Cain. Talk a little bit about that and how people justify in their mind. I guess they don't think of it as racism, right? They think of it as some sort of biblical construct.
Yeah, I think that's right. If you ask people straight up, most of the time the answer will be, well, it's not racist. But, what's remarkable to me, again, when you steep yourself in the history a little bit more, you realize that the pro-slavery Christian authors really had the biblical upper hand. They could quote chapter and verse in support of slavery, not only places where slavery in the Bible is mentioned and not condemned, but places even in the New Testament, the book of Philemon in the New Testament, where an enslaved person who escapes from bondage is asking advice about what to do. And the advice from the Apostle Paul is go back into bondage, right? That's the appropriate thing to do. Slaves, obey your masters. I mean, that is directly in the biblical text. It wasn't that far there, but I think one of the more pernicious ones is the one that you were referring to. It is this what was often called the mark of Cain. It's a story out of the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, right from the book of Genesis, where it's talking about these two brothers, Cain and Abel, and Cain is jealous of his brother Abel. He kills him one day, and then when God asks him about it, he denies it. But ultimately, God spares his life for committing this criminal act. But the biblical text just says that he marked him as a way of, actually it's a way of protecting him in the text, but this gets twisted and morphed in white Christian clergy hands and white Christian theologians' hands into an origin story for how dark-skinned people make it onto the earth, right? So Adam and Eve are white in this interpretation of the story, and so was Cain and Abel until Cain committed murder and God marked him with this kind of racial marking. And so what this does, right, is it sets up this hierarchy where the original humans are white, and the way we get dark-skinned people on the earth is through a criminal act, right? It's a convicted murderer who becomes the progenitor of all dark-skinned people on the earth. So you can see how this serves a kind of white supremacist purpose, right? That you've got an origin story that's fairly noble for white people, and an origin story for everyone else that literally has their ancestor farther back as a criminal.
And do they not understand that the human origin was in Africa? Because it'd be very difficult for people to be white in Africa. They don't believe that, I guess.
Right. No, I think that certainly creates all kinds of problems, for this worldview. But the one thing about that goes to Jesus, right? I mean, certainly, yeah. If you just step back, I mean, first of all, the Bible doesn't really describe Jesus' physical appearance, and as you said, he was certainly Middle Eastern. He was Jewish. He by no means would be looking like someone from Western Europe, but yet, if you think about the logic, if you have an a priori commitment to white supremacy with an understanding and a commitment that, God's design for human civilization is that white people will be over everyone else, and their job is a fairly paternalistic one, in fact, is to bring everybody else along up to the level that white people already are. If that's the preconceived frame for everything, then even Jesus has to be white, right? Even as contradictory as that is, and certainly should be, head exploding to someone who's a biblical literalist. But yet, if you think about it, particularly for evangelical faith, where it's about a very intimate relationship with Jesus, and you use phrases like, let Jesus come into your heart. I mean, there's hymns that have that language in it. But for someone who's committed to white supremacy, Jesus certainly had to be white. There's no way that someone who's white and has those views could have that kind of intimate relationship with someone who's not white, or open their heart, right, to someone Middle Eastern or dark skinned to come into their heart. I mean, this would have rattled every thing they thought of in terms of how race was properly understood.
Yeah, and I guess that explains also their real terror about Muslims. Like, just the fact of Muslims existing seems to freak these people out.
Yeah, I mean, it sets up all kinds of things that are tinged with both race and religion. There's absolutely no doubt that when we hear, for example, I'm already thinking about the Republican National Convention coming up, and at the last one, for example, if you had been playing some drinking game where every time you heard the term radical Islamic terrorist, you took a drink, I mean, you would have been under the table in like 10 minutes. Yeah. And we're going to hear more of that, but it fits hand in glove. It fits hand in glove with anti-immigrant, a sentiment, with keeping, their images really are about brown-skinned people pouring over the border from Mexico, right? That's the scary scenario that President Trump and his administration have painted. And you put all that together, and it really is, again, the core animating feature here is preserving an America that is white and Christian, and that is a kind of divinely mandated mission. And that just goes all the way back.
you take it through everything from snatching, indigenous children and putting them in quote unquote schools to make them more acclimatized to white culture, or caging little brown migrant children as if they're animals. I mean, it really does go through. This is a fascinating book. My final question, my exit question to you, Robert Jones, because you know everything. You're really smart. So I'm going to ask you this question. What do you foresee happening, just looking at it as a social scientist and knowing this data the way you know it so well? What happens if Donald Trump loses in the minds of these people, and what might they do?
I hope it's an invitation to be for there to be an opportunity for there to be a course correction. I think that we are at a very key moment in the country's history. I mean, I think even 10, 20 years from now, we will look back at 2020 as a possible turning point, as we do with the civil rights movement, as we did with the Reconstruction. I mean, there have been these moments, and I think we're in one where the mirror is being held up to the country's face. And I think we have a real choice, here to make that's much, much bigger than a partisan choice, but it really is about what kind of a country do we want to live in? Who are we as a people? I think about James Baldwin writing, 50 years ago, and I read a lot of James Baldwin writing this book, and in fact, the title, I should say, actually comes from a James Baldwin quote where he was concerned, really, that white Americans, he put it, he was worried that white Americans had become, and this was after the assassination of King and Bobby Kennedy, had become beyond moral rehabilitation, that we had been white too long. That's the context for the title of the book. But elsewhere he talked about like the opportunity, if we can face it, if we can face this history, we can find another path, here. And the way he put it was, we can end the racial nightmare and achieve our country and change the history of the world. And if ever there were a patriotic sentiment, I think that is it. And I think that invitation to patriotism and an invitation to help our country live into its ideals is one that's right before us today.
Robert P. Jones, one of the smartest men I know. I'm very lucky to know this person. What does the P stand for, by the way? What's the P?
Patrick.
Robert Patrick Jones. I love it. Robert, a.k.a. Robbie Jones, you're great. Thank you so much for being here. Really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you. The book is called White Too Long. We now know the origins of this title. Brilliant work, always. Thank you very much, Robert. Really appreciate you being here.
Thanks, Joy. That's so kind. It's so great to be with you today.
All right. Thank you so much to Robbie Jones. The book is White Too Long. It is a terrific book. Everybody should read it. And yes, it has charts. And yes, I love charts. In honor of James Baldwin getting a great mention, not only in the title of that book, but because when on the time that we're recording this, we're right around just after James Baldwin's birthday, which is Baldwin Day, we like to call it. Here's some reading for you if you want to put this on your list of things to read. James Baldwin, Blues for Mr. Charlie. We've got Write Me, or we've got, well, no, this is not James Baldwin, this is another person's book. We have James Baldwin book, Another Country and The Fire Next Time. All good books to read. And of course, Notes of a Native Son. All of these are on my little listy of books that you should read, because they're James Baldwin books, and you should read everything by James Baldwin. All right, well, thank you all for tuning in. This has been a really informative, as they all are, what to read. Do you feel informed?
I feel very informed.
All right, Jason feels informed. I feel informed. Thank you guys for tuning in. Please please give us some comments. Let us know what you think of this episode, and let us know what other interviews you'd like us to include in the What to Read series.
Please, fam, hit that notification bell.
That notification bell, because that way we can make sure that you know when there's a new What to Read.
Thumbs up, like button.
Give us a like. Why not? And of course, please subscribe.
We're trying to build a subscription count up.
There you go. So subscribe, whether it's on YouTube or also on Spotify or on Apple Podcasts, because why would you not want to do that? You want to always make sure you get your What to Read. All right, guys, thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you on the next What to Read.
Thank you, fam.
Goodbye.
Bye.